Hey pirate fans around the world, this is Edward Lowe, the cruelest pirate stories that give you nightmares. If anyone thinks pirate cruelty has a ceiling, Edward Lowe is the cold reminder that some captains treated fear itself as a daily tool, escalating when ordinary violence no longer felt efficient. Edward Lowe still matters because his life explains why merchant captains changed their routes, why insurance rates climbed, and why even other pirates whispered his name with caution. His reputation did not come from tall tales alone. It came from depositions, trial records, and survivor narratives that described methods beyond the usual rules at sea. This story will lay out where he came from, how he rose, what he did, and what his end might have been, using plain language, steady pacing, and verified moments from the record so that anyone can follow the arc from beginnings to legacy. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy and want to fall asleep with pirate stories whenever you want. A single incident often carries the weight of a legend, and one episode attached to Edward Lowe does just that. In the early 1720s, a captured crew stood helpless as their ship's master was singled out after refusing to give the kind of cooperation pirates often demanded. Contemporary accounts say Lowe made an example of him. No elaborate torture chamber, no horror movie theatrics, just calculated humiliation and sudden deliberate harm that other sailors could see from the deck. There is no need to describe anything graphic here. The important point is that the act was public, meant to travel from harbor to harbor as rumor, and it did. Within weeks, other ships were lowering their voices and discussing what might happen if Lowe appeared out of the haze. The story hardened into a warning, which is exactly how Lowe used it, not as a one-time outburst, but as a signal of policy. Those signals were not kept alive by gossip alone. Depositions taken after captures, reports forwarded to colonial governors, and the famous printed collections of pirate histories all preserved details. A prisoner's narrative from New England described Lowe as a captain who laughed when others hesitated and who seemed most dangerous when routine bored him. A court testimony out of Rhode Island described a crew that understood its captain's moods and, under pressure, enforced them. A printed history, a book that many 19th century readers kept on their shelves, repeated several of these stories and presented them as part of a larger pattern. Even if later writers shaped the stories for drama, the backbone holds specific dates, named ships and ports that match real traffic in real months. That is why the figure of Lowe still stands out. He stood out because many pirates, though violent, lived by practical rules that limited damage for reasons of business. Terror could make a crew surrender faster, but unrestrained brutality risked mutiny on the pirate side and total resistance on the merchant side. Lowe often ignored those calculations. Where other captains used intimidation as a tool, he sometimes treated it as the craft. The difference may sound subtle, but it changed outcomes. People who expected a transaction, surrender, search, and release, suddenly faced a man who turned punishment into a message. A calm note here: this script will not dwell on gore. The focus is on strategy and consequence, because understanding the logic explains why his name traveled farther than many of his contemporaries. To picture his world, imagine the sea lanes like highways with seasonal traffic. In the north, ships left the New England ports toward fishing grounds and the Azores. In the south, the Caribbean carried sugar, tobacco, and the goods that clothed half the Atlantic. Along the middle belt, vessels carried timber, grain, and salted fish, feeding the islands and the mainland. Lowe operated in several of these zones and moved between them when pressure mounted. That flexibility mattered. Merchants feared him because he might appear where the charts said pirates rarely roamed. That month, the sea was large, yes, but the useful routes were narrow. If a captain like Lowe learned the rhythm of winds and the routines of convoys, he could sit just beyond the horizon and watch for sails that meant profit. A quick orientation to the arc ahead helps keep the story clear. First, a fast portrait of his early life and what pushed him toward piracy. Second, his first raids and how his methods took shape. Third, The high point of his terror with 3 case studies that show style more than spectacle. Fourth, the decline with crew fractures and relentless pursuit. And finally, the unresolved ending. 2 or 3 competing possibilities weighed against the best evidence available. That is the path to follow. The cast around him deserves a brief introduction. A captain is never alone. Quartermasters guided discipline on deck, and when strong, acted as a balance to the captain's will. Sailing masters plotted courses and read the sky. Gun crews managed the small arms and swivel guns that could sweep a crowded deck. Among Lowe's circle, there were lieutenants who copied his manner, and a talented quartermaster who later sailed off under his own black flag after a falling out. An episode that shows how unstable a pirate organization could be. There were also captive specialists, carpenters, surgeons, and even a few unlucky navigators pressed into service when their skills were too valuable to release. How does anyone know all of this centuries later? The short answer is a mix of primary sources, trial records, depositions, newspapers, ship logs, and secondary sources that compiled these into narratives. Some sources are reliable because they were created for courts where perjury could be punished. Others were printed for readers who liked a good story and may have included embellishments. A careful approach watches for dates that line up across documents, for names that appear in multiple places, and for routes that match the season's winds. The goal is not to present a perfect portrait. The goal is to present a faithful one. What did terror achieve in practice? It shortened negotiations. When a merchant crew had heard that cooperation might not matter, resistance could fall apart before it began. Conversely, a captain like Lowe counted on speed. The faster the surrender, the less gunpowder spent, the less risk to his own men, and the quicker he could move on before a patrol arrived. Fear, then, was not a hobby. It was a multiplier, just as insurance rates were a measure of that multiplier on shore. Typical pirate articles. The rules a crew agreed to before a cruise set limits on drinking, fighting, and the division of plunder. Many outlaw crews enforce due process of a sort. Quarrels settled by vote, punishments known in advance, shares allocated to keep specialists loyal. Lowe frequently broke these expectations or bent them when it suited him. When a captain overrides custom, he gets speed and sometimes short-term loyalty from those who enjoy a strong hand. He also gets simmering doubt among those who prefer rules they can trust. That tension appears again and again in accounts of Lowe's later months. A few open questions sit at the center of the story and will be revisited along the way. Was Lowe a product of poverty and violence in his youth? Or did the sea harden him into something worse? Did he maintain collaborators on land who disguised stolen goods and kept him supplied? Or did he mostly ride luck in the chaos of shallow harbors? And what happened at the end? A quiet disappearance, a scaffold in a foreign port, or something in between? Each possibility has documents behind it, and each has gaps. To begin at the beginning, Edward Lowe's early life was spent in the rough quarters of London, in streets where a boy learned to survive by quick hands and sharp eyes. He was not born into wealth, and he was no gentleman adventurer. He grew up with the casual violence of crowded alleys, among people who measured success one day at a time. That background did not force him to become a pirate, but it did not teach patience or faith in authorities either. As a teenager, he gravitated toward the water because the Thames offered work and a way out. Like many poor Londoners, he found his way to the docks, then to a ship, then across the Atlantic to New England. In New England, he worked as a rigger and general hand. The region was growing quickly, and ships needed men who could climb, stitch, and keep the rhythm of lines and sails. He married, tried to settle, and for a time it looked like he would remain a working sailor with a modest family life. Then hardship struck, money ran thin, tempers sharpened, and a small-time theft or a workplace quarrel pushed him toward a traveling job that moved him south along the coast and into the warmer waters near the Bay of Honduras, where logwood was cut and loaded by crews who worked hard for indifferent pay. There, one hot day, after an argument over wages and treatment, a sailor named Lowe drew a line he could not easily step back over. A shot was fired, A threat was made, and the decision to abandon ordinary work became real. The step from anger to piracy is shorter when a ship is already armed and a crew is already unhappy. It is shorter still when a man like Lowe tells others he is not afraid to seize a sloop and try his luck. His first raids showed a learning curve. Early on, he relied on speed, choosing small, fast vessels that could overtake merchants without a prolonged chase. He followed the wind, aimed for ships that looked lightly armed, and made sure the first minutes of contact set a tone. If a prize surrendered quickly, he sometimes let the ship go after taking what he needed most: provisions, ammunition, and a few skilled men who did not want to come, but had no choice. If a crew stalled for time, his reputation suggested that a lesson would be delivered. Again, no need for lurid details here. The point is that by the time he left a captured deck, he wanted word to spread. Compliance did not guarantee safety, and defiance could be worse. His tactics, refined over months, combined deception and pressure. He sometimes approached under neutral colors, switching flags only at the last moment. He learned to read a ship's posture. A merchant running downwind with too much sail set might be nervous. A captain who kept his course while a strange sloop approached might be confident or resigned. He used signals to coordinate with consorts, other pirate ships sailing nearby, and trained his men to swarm quickly once grapnels bit. That speed mattered because every minute raised the odds that a patrol would spot the smoke of guns or the chaos of two ships locked together. As his reputation grew, so did his little fleet. He attracted ambitious officers who enjoyed the tempo and the share of goods. For a time he traveled with a capable quartermaster who organized plunder, kept lists, and tried to impose some order. That man, talented and ambitious, eventually left after a dispute and became a captain in his own right, taking a segment of Lowe's crew and a ship with him. The split cost Lowe structure and damaged crew trust. It also taught observers a lesson. The same force that terrifies enemies can drive allies away when it treats every disagreement as disloyalty. A case study captures the mid-period style. In the North Atlantic, a merchant ship on a routine run spotted a small sloop hugging the windward edge of its course. The sloop swung close, showed friendly colors, and asked for water. As casks were hoisted, the sloop cut across the merchant's bow, ran up the black flag, and delivered a short volley into the rigging, not to kill but to cripple. Within minutes, armed pirates were on deck, and the quarterdeck was surrounded. The captain was moved aside, the mate was questioned briskly, and the cargo manifest was examined with an eye for items that could be sold quickly: textiles, tools, and the kind of staple goods that fetched good prices in island markets. Witnesses later said, Lowe inspected the men and made his mood clear. A small group was taken, the better to crew additional prizes. Before departing, Lowe gave instructions that the merchant captain would not forget. The ship limped into harbor short-handed, with a story that needed no embellishment. A second case study shows range. Farther south, near an island where traffic thinned in the late season, Lowe's vessels lay in wait at a point where currents met. The method was patience. When a lone brigantine appeared on the horizon, Lowe shadowed it until dusk, and then closed under the cover of lowering light. A few shots into the air persuaded the brigantine to heave to. The boarding party went straight to the stores. Barrels of flour, salted meat, and casks of water were transferred quickly. A surgeon was identified among the prisoners and offered a choice he could not refuse: remain and tend the crew or be set ashore in a place remote from help. The surgeon stayed. His skills saved lives in the weeks that followed, and his later testimony saved details of what he saw. A third case study, closer to the end, shows stress in the system. After a string of captures, patrols increased. Lowe pushed into zones where supply was uncertain. A skirmish with an armed merchant left damage to a mast and lost time. Disagreements sharpened on deck. A mate urged a turn toward easier waters, but Lowe insisted on pressing the campaign. The argument ended, but the memory of it did not. Within days, a faction of the crew began to whisper about leaving at the first harbor that offered cover. Some did. Among the survivors who left their words on paper, one stands out. A young fisherman from New England was taken by Lowe's crew and forced to serve for months. He later escaped on a small island and survived by catching turtles and keeping a hidden fire. In his narrative, the fisherman wrote that Lowe's temper was a weather vane, calm one moment, furious the next, unpredictable in a way that kept men alert for danger even when all seemed well. This account has been used for generations because it came from a plain man with little reason to invent. He did not write poetry about the sea. He wrote a catalog of days under a captain who treated mercy as rare. Why did terror serve a purpose beyond the moment? It moved information. Sailors talked in taverns. Merchants wrote home. Governors wrote warnings to neighboring colonies. An incident in one harbor could depress morale hundreds of miles away, making crews more likely to surrender, making insurers more likely to raise rates, and making naval officers more likely to request larger budgets. In that sense, Lowe's behavior had an economy of its own. The value extracted from a cargo was one column. The value added by fear was another. On deck, leadership and discipline followed the captain's mood. When he was decisive and focused on prizes, the machine worked. When boredom or anger crept in, punishment followed, and the crew learned to avoid the captain's gaze. Mutiny risk rose as confidence fell. Quartermasters traditionally served as a check, but with a captain like Lowe, the balance tilted toward the quarterdeck. He allowed himself to act first and justify later. In the short term, that delivered speed. In the longer term, it ate away the trust that keeps a crew from splintering. Life aboard under Lowe looked like life aboard almost any ship, with a darker edge at critical moments. Rations were simple: salted meat when available, hard bread often infested with pests, peas and beans, and water that soured with time. A captured cask of wine or a barrel of fresh water was celebrated. Work was constant: sail handling, gun drills, cleaning, and the endless maintenance that kept wood and rope from failing. A surgeon's kit meant lives saved after accidents and skirmishes. Without one, even minor wounds could turn serious. Music, jokes, and small rituals filled the off hours, because men at sea have always made the most of narrow comfort. Rivalries built around Lowe. Some captains refused to engage him when they believed they could run. Others took the risk, and sometimes paid dearly. Governors issued letters of marque to privateers who hunted pirates in exchange for prize money and favor at court. Naval sloops and frigates prowled the same lanes, following reports from fishing boats and merchants who claimed to have seen Lowe's sails. As pressure grew, Lowe changed routes more often, using knowledge of currents to slip away at the last moment. Two pursuits in particular are worth reconstructing because they show both his skill and his luck. In the first, a naval sloop sighted Lowe's ship just after dawn. The wind favored the pursuer, and the distance closed through the morning. Rather than run in a straight line, Lowe angled toward a known shoal, counting on local memory. He shaved the edge. The naval captain, worried about grounding, gave the shoal a wider berth. That caution bought Lowe 2 precious hours, and by sunset he was a smudge on the horizon. In the second chase, a privateer with a faster hull nearly trapped Lowe between an island and the open sea. Lowe responded by jettisoning weight and ordering every stitch of sail set, riding the gusts at the risk of snapping spars. A sudden squall flattened visibility. When it lifted, Lowe was gone. Chance played its part, but knowledge did too. The business behind the violence, what happened to stolen goods, matters because it anchored Lowe to land. Textiles, tools, candles, and foodstuffs moved quickly through middlemen who asked few questions. Sometimes entire prizes were ransomed back, a practice that sounded civilized but in fact rewarded speed and intimidation. Jewelry and small valuables were divided among the crew. Powder and shot were hoarded. Maps and instruments were prized. In markets where officials looked the other way, Pirate goods blended into ordinary commerce and paid for repairs, recruits, and bribes. He needed places to rest and refit. Shallow inlets, mangrove-lined shores, and quiet keys offered cover to careen a hull, meaning to beach a ship and scrape away the growth that slowed it. These spots were also recruitment grounds, because discontented sailors and bold young men could be found in every port. A carpenter, captured on Monday, might be repairing a mast by Friday. A navigator might find that his new employer paid in freedom rather than coin. That is the blunt truth of recruitment under a flag that did not ask permission. The law tried to keep up. When pirate crews were caught, they were brought to trial in colonial courts that used admiralty procedures. Evidence read aloud, witnesses questioned, and judges who understood that a verdict carried a message. Some of Lowe's associates faced these courts, and their confessions, whether voluntary or not, entered the record. Those pages reveal the routines of a cruise, how watches were set, how shares were calculated, and how arguments were handled. They also reveal a habit of justification. Men claimed they were forced to join or lacked the chance to escape. Some told the truth. Others told the court what they thought it wanted to hear. Decline came from familiar pressures. Supplies grew thin after longer chases and fewer successful captures. Damaged rigging slowed the ships. Rumors of betrayal circulated after a failed rendezvous. A lieutenant began favoring his own circle. 2 fights broke out in the same week, and a good sailor lost a finger in one of them. The surgeon shook his head and said the crew was wearing out. Another captain, once an ally, refused to cooperate, and a valuable chance slipped away. None of these problems alone would have sunk the venture, but together they formed a weight that even a strong-willed captain could not throw off easily. As for his fate, the documents offer several possibilities. One says he was caught by a foreign patrol after a misjudged anchorage and executed in short order, an end that would fit the urgency with which his name was spoken. Another claims he was set adrift by his own men after an explosion of temper that pushed them past fear into revolt. That version paints him as the author of his own downfall. A third, less dramatic, suggests he slipped away under a false name and died quietly, because even a man like Lowe might prefer a dark corner to a public stage at the end. Each theory rests on fragments, a letter, a line in a journal, a printed paragraph. Weighing them fairly means admitting what is known and what is not. Now, to place him in context, it helps to separate myth from fact. Popular images of pirates often show constant sword fights, fluttering flags, and gold coins spilling across tables. The day-to-day reality was more about patience, maintenance, and work that never ended. Many pirate ships operated by rules that shared power in ways unusual for their time. Captains elected, quartermasters checked authority, and shares of profit rewarded skill, not birth. Lowe sometimes used these structures and sometimes brushed them aside. The image of a captain who always fights hand-to-hand is an invention. The real weapon was endurance, reinforced by the threat of sudden harm. Historians disagree about Lowe because the sources themselves disagree. A widely read 18th century collection of pirate stories mixed court records with sea yarns. Later editors cleaned and reprinted those stories, sometimes as literature rather than history. At the same time, newly discovered depositions and local court papers surfaced in archives that earlier writers never saw. When a modern historian compares them, the result is a mosaic that requires care. The method here stays simple. When multiple independent sources agree on a date, a name, and a place, confidence goes up. When a single flowery account sits alone, caution increases. Compared with other feared captains of his era, Lowe's reputation for cruelty ranked high. Some captains used terror as a last resort. Lowe used it earlier and more often. Others balanced fear with negotiation. Lowe leaned on fear first and allowed negotiation second. That does not mean he was the only violent pirate. It means his use of violence as policy distinguished him. This distinction, repeated by survivors and amplified by print, turned his name into shorthand for the darkest version of the trade. The cultural afterlife followed. Ballads and broadside prints appeared with scenes inspired by his deeds. Later novels folded a low-like figure into their casts. A captain quick to anger, famous for a handful of incidents that eclipsed all other details. In modern media, the archetype of the cruel pirate often owes more to him than to better-known names. He became a reference point, the way certain city crimes become a nickname for every similar event that follows. Ethically, the story forces a simple reflection. When someone turns fear into a tool, it works until it doesn't. It speeds victory, but it also breeds revolt, invites relentless pursuit, and corrodes the bonds that make a crew function under stress. Lowe's career demonstrates that short-term gains can create long-term traps, especially when reputations take on a life of their own. The men who served under him enjoyed rich days after successful raids. They also endured lean weeks and cruel moods when luck turned. Some common questions deserve quick, clear answers. Was Lowe uniquely evil among pirates? He was extreme, yes, but not alone in cruelty. He stood out for frequency and for the way he used violence as a message. Did he ever follow the usual pirate rules? Early on, he seems to have kept to a familiar pattern of shares and votes. Later, he overrode them when convenient. Did he command a famous single ship with a household name? He appears to have rotated through several fast vessels, losing and replacing them as events required. Did he bury treasure? Records point much more often to rapid sale and quick spending than to burial. For those curious to read further, a practical route helps. Start with printed court records and colonial newspapers that mention his captures and the trials of his associates. Add a prisoner narrative by a New England fisherman who escaped after months under Lowe. Then consult the 18th century compilations of pirate histories, reading them with a watchful eye for drama. Finally, visit modern academic work that cross-checks dates and ports. Taken together, these sources give a clear view without asking for specialized knowledge. To close the first half of the story with a steady takeaway, Edward Lowe shows how one person can reshape a sea lane by reputation alone. He rose from poverty to command by speed, nerve, and a willingness to break rules that other pirates kept. Because those rules made business easier, his name became a warning. His methods bought victories and later invited ruin. That dual truth power purchased at the cost of stability is why his name still disturbs. A gentle bridge forward sets up what remains. Deeper looks at the maps he used, the tools his men carried, the composition of his crews, the medical realities that shaped survival at sea, the seasons that opened or closed his hunting grounds, the countermeasures merchants adopt, the financial footprint reflected in insurance records. A few brief primary source excerpts read with care, 3 short late-stage vignettes that keep the Night Watch energy steady, a set of fast myth-busting notes, a practical mini-guide to exploring archives from home, a clear explanation of signal flags and deception at sea, and the practical logistics that kept a wooden world moving: water, wood, and sail repair. Then the ending, the best assessment of what likely happened to Edward Lowe and why that answer matters for understanding the pirate age. He sailed in a world ruled by wind and habit, where a clever captain could sit beside a current and let it bring food, money, and sometimes trouble straight to his deck. Those who hunted him learned his patterns. Those who feared him learned to look twice at a small sloop that came smiling across the waves. He will now be followed into the machinery of his craft, how he chose where to wait, how the ocean itself helped him, and how the map of currents and choke points turned into a playbook that any careful sailor could read, and that he read with ruthless clarity. As the northern summer warmed the water, ships moved predictably along the Great Arc from Europe to the New World and back again. Trade winds blew steady belts across the Atlantic, and the return routes climbed north to catch westerlies home. The Caribbean islands acted like stones in a river, splitting currents and funneling traffic through narrow passages. Lowe learned the same lesson known to fishermen and pilots. The sea has lanes even without paint. and most captains prefer the smoother ones. He placed himself near those lanes, especially where a harmless-looking inlet offered a quick retreat. A sailor who knows a back door can step out while others are still looking for the handle. Currents aside, winds were the true clock. In fair weather, a lightly loaded sloop could outrun a heavier merchant by using every puff, tacking smartly where a sluggish captain hesitated to change course. When a squall line appeared, Low used it rather than fled it, slipping into rain where visibility cut to a few ship lengths. He had no magic. He had practice. His sailing master called the angles, his helmsman obeyed, and his crew trimmed sails with the muscle memory that comes from 100 drills. By the time the rain lifted, a pursuer could be searching the wrong quadrant. Weapons aboard were simple but effective. Pistols and cutlasses mattered up close. Muskets mattered at medium range. Small swivel guns, mounted along the rails, could throw clusters of shot that cleared an enemy's deck long enough for a boarding party to leap. Granadas, small hand-thrown explosives, made noise and confusion. None of this was unique to Low, but his crews trained to use them quickly, and their confidence showed. In boarding, speed is mercy to one's own side. The faster a fight ends, the fewer men are lost. That was the calculus that guided many hardened captains, and it guided Low. Crew composition reflects the economy of the Atlantic. English, Irish, Scots, Africans, and men from the islands worked side by side. Skills counted. A carpenter might earn a bonus, a surgeon might be exempt from some duties, and a good navigator was treated with a wary kind of respect. Recruitment followed opportunity. A captured sailor with a steady hand could be offered a place. Some accepted willingly. Many accepted because the alternative was worse. Over time, the core of loyal men grew around a captain's habits. Under a stable leader, that core thickened. Under Low, it held until it didn't. Another reminder that style at the top shapes everything below. Medicine aboard was practical. A surgeon kept knives, needles, salves, and spirits. He could set a bone, close a wound, and drain an infection when luck allowed. He had no antibiotics, but he had experience, which sometimes amounts to the same thing when choices are simple. Scurvy, caused by lack of fresh foods, crept up on long cruises. The remedy, citrus or fresh greens, was known by some in practical terms, even if the science would come later. A captured cargo of fruit could feel like treasure, because it meant stronger arms at the braces and fewer men lost to weakness. Seasons dictated strategy. Hurricanes in late summer made some runs dangerous and others wise. Monsoon patterns on the far side of the ocean, though distant, influenced arrivals in the Caribbean. Low did not control these forces, but he respected them. He shifted his hunt when storms increased and pressed his luck when patrols were pulled elsewhere. In winter, colder waters near the fishing grounds could be thinly patrolled, but unforgiving if a mast snapped. In summer, the heat wore on men and ropes alike, but currents and trade winds made certain ambush points almost too tempting to ignore. Merchants and navies responded. Convoys clustered, sailing together so that guns and men could be concentrated when a threat appeared. Decoy ships carried concealed weapons to surprise an attacker. Captains trained to use stern-chase guns to damage a pursuer's rigging, rather than try to kill men in a direct fight. Rudders and sails are targets that end a chase without filling the sea with blood. Insurance companies raised rates on routes considered dangerous and offered lower premiums for convoy participation. These financial levers pushed captains towards safer habits, and safer habits sometimes meant avoiding the lanes Low preferred, which in turn changed where he had to hunt. Insurance records and port books, dry as they sound, show the shadow of a man like Low. When rates rise on a certain lane for a certain season, something caused the change. When a harbor log notes an unusual number of damaged ships arriving from a particular quarter, it suggests persistent trouble. Even if a clerk never wrote the name Low, the curve of the numbers lines up with his presence. That is how historians connect a feared name to calm lists kept by men who never saw a black flag in their lives. A brief excursion into primary source voices adds color without excess. A prisoner in one deposition said, "The captain spoke soft, and smiled, and the men understood to be quick. Another stated, he would not be delayed, describing a search that moved through a ship like a tide. A colonial governor wrote that certain villains have made the sea uneasy. These sentences are plain, not poetic, and because they are plain, they ring true. They also prove a useful point. The legend rests not only on later storytellers, but on paperwork written by people with no time for embellishment. Late in his run, 3 short scenes, the Nightmare Triad, show how momentum can carry a captain forward even as foundations crack. First scene. At dawn, a merchant refuses to stop. A warning shot takes a sail. The deck is taken. The crew, already frightened by Lowe's name, offers little resistance. The capture is efficient and without spectacle, and still the fear deepens across the route. Second scene. A prize crew, sent to sail a captured ship back to a friendly inlet, loses its way, and a patrol recaptures the prize. The court later learns that the prize crew argued as the wind shifted, a sign that training and trust have frayed. Third scene. In a crowded anchorage, Lowe meets an old associate who refuses a proposed alliance. Voices rise. Both men part without agreement. Observers whisper that something has changed, that Lowe's aura no longer bends others so easily. None of these moments is dramatic alone. Together they sound like a bell. Now, myth-busting in quick strokes helps keep the record clear. He did not always fly a black flag before a fight. Surprise mattered more. He did not spend his life digging holes for coins. Moving goods fast made better business. He did not duel captains on empty beaches as a matter of honor. Outcomes were determined by wind, weight of metal, and who made the first smart choice under stress. And while some pirates ran their ships like rough democracies, Lowe often shortened debates when he wanted speed. These corrections do not make the story dull. They make it believable. For anyone eager to explore further, the modern world offers quiet ways to do it. Digitized court papers and old newspapers can be read from a chair at home. Keywords like pirate, trial, and the names of ports will bring up pages that most readers have never seen. Many require patience rather than specialized skill. Read a page, note a date, and compare it with another. Museums and libraries host scanned ship logs, short daily notes about weather, position, and small events that together become a living ocean. With those, the map of a pirate's season unfolds in a way that feels almost like being there without the risk of splinters or squalls. Communication at sea deserves a moment, because it turned confusion into advantage. Signal flags allowed ships to coordinate in daylight. At night, lantern patterns did the trick. Deception worked here too. A flag that suggested one nationality could buy a few minutes of calm. Lowe used these tools, modestly but effectively. In one recorded approach, he kept up friendly colors until he was close enough that a pursuing wind left the merchant with no easy turn. Then the flag changed, and the game was over before it began. Finally, logistics, water, wood, and sail repair kept the enterprise alive. Barrels, known as casks, were the heartbeat of a ship. Cooperage, the craft of making and repairing barrels, was essential. Fresh water was life. The decision to risk a shore run for it could decide whether a cruise continued or ended. Wood for spars and planks came from quiet coves where trees grew tall and straight. A day spent careening a hull removed the drag that cost speed. And speed was the difference between a profitable hunt and a chase that ended in irons. In a world built of wood and rope, the glamorous moments depend on the unglamorous ones. A man with a hammer tapping iron bands tight around a cask. A sailor with a lantern inspecting lines for wear. This measured look at the machinery of Lowe's career prepares the ending. The final question remains, which fate best fits the pattern? An abrupt execution in a foreign port would explain the sudden silence in the record and the sharp tone of a few official letters that follow. A mutiny would explain the bitterness in some later testimonies and the way his crew's splintering accelerated near the end. A quiet death under a false name would explain the absence of a final flourish in the papers that tracked him so faithfully for months at a time. Each answer has its advocates. The best that careful reading can say is this: the man who relied on fear may have met a straightforward end, because the institutions he mocked were patient and in the long run thorough. When his name appears on a page, it carries two lessons. The first is practical. Reputation can move faster than any sloop. The second is human. A leader who takes pride in breaking the rules that hold a group together will find those rules missing when he needs them most. Edward Lowe's career gave the Atlantic a season of anxiety. It also gave historians a clear case study of how strategy, rumor, law, and luck intersect on the open sea. He crossed seas where currents behaved like winding roads, and those roads taught patterns to anyone patient enough to watch. Let's take it step by step. In the western Atlantic, the Gulf Stream ran like a river within the ocean, warm and fast, lifting a small, lively sloop farther than its size might suggest. Lowe understood that a pursuer that misread the edge of that stream could struggle to keep contact. He did not fight the water, he partnered with it. Quick fact: the sea does not care who is right, only who reads it correctly. He read it correctly often enough to stay one sunrise ahead of the men sent to stop him. His approach to targets mixed boldness with homework. He favored silhouettes that merchants trusted, a modest profile, sails trimmed not to boast speed, but to imply routine. Approaching the beam of a merchant at mid-afternoon, he often let the other captain feel comfortable. A man who believes he is safe turns his attention to small chores, log entries, and the day's drift. Only when distance narrowed to a few cable lengths would the truth arrive. Even then, he preferred control to chaos. A volley into rigging disrupted movement. A shouted order froze the quarterdeck. The sooner faces looked to him for the next step, the sooner the scene became a transaction he could choreograph. On his decks, the tools of that choreography lay close at hand. Pistols were kept dry in oiled cloth. Cutlasses were no more exotic than a farmer's tools, sharpened, hung, and checked. Swivel guns, small but persuasive, could rake a rail with a burst of shot that made the bravest sailor duck. Granadas, thrown by steady hands, created sound more frightening than their blast. He used these not to satisfy a taste for noise, but to end debates quickly. A short debate is safer than a long one. That line, simple as it sounds, explains many of his choices. Men followed him for complicated reasons. Some were true believers in the life he offered, shares of profit, a loosened hierarchy, and fewer bows to people on shore. Others were practical. A surgeon with a family might decide that living to see them again required doing the work before him today, and not asking questions that risked tomorrow. There were also the young and restless. Men whose future on merchant ships looked like unending obedience for poor pay. Lowe gave them a chance. Dangerous, yes, but layered with the permission to argue, sing, and spend in ways they had never known. That permission always came with a hidden cost. They lived inside the weather of one man's mood. A steady, neutral voice can say this plainly. The mood of the captain filtered into every space on board. The cook felt it when he salted the last of the meat and worried whether more could be captured in time. The carpenter felt it when a spar cracked in a squall and he needed help to raise a replacement in heavy seas. The boy in the galley felt it when laughter turned too loud or too quiet. A humane system cushions these moments with rules. Lowe's system, dependent on his temper, sometimes stripped those cushions away. Heads up on this. Leadership style is not decoration, it is infrastructure. One lingering question intrigues many listeners. Was he always the man described in the hardest stories, or did the role grow with his reputation? People sometimes become the thing others expect them to be, especially when fear is the currency. Consider a captured mate who testified that once they knew him, they gave over the chase before he was on them. That line is not dramatic. It is practical. It says that a name can do the work of a cannon. If a captain sees surrender sooner, he gets more prizes with less risk. In that sense, cruelty spoken of across ports supported efficiency measured in captured cargo. It is worth lingering on the conversations that followed his sails ashore. In a harbor tavern, a merchant's clerk told a fisherman, who told a ship's boy, who told a woman who sold bread to sailors, who told a man repairing nets at the quay. Each edition changed the shape of the story by a degree or two, but the core remained. He had made a point in public, not because the act was necessary to take a ship, but because it was useful to broadcast that small war could become a large one if anyone resisted. These were the nights when the city felt smaller, when every person swore that a certain friend had seen it with his own eyes. That is how rumor becomes record. One careful official writes down what 3 careless mouths repeated. He was not the only player in this game. Colonial governors and naval captains were learning too. They learned to ask for more patrols. In months when seas were calmer and targets richer, they learned to use fast sloops rather than heavy ships in narrow waters. They learned to partner with privateers, civilians with permission to fight, because those men knew the local trick of a tide as well as any fisherman. Lowe's opponents grew sharper because of him, and this shaped his final months more than any single storm. The sea does not stand still, neither did the people who sailed it. A pause to map the lattice of commerce he disrupted helps. Sugar, tobacco, indigo, and dyes moved north and east. Timber, salted fish, livestock, and homespun cloth moved south and west. Every barrel of flour that went missing created a small shortage in a hungry port. Every coil of rope sold to pay for repairs fed the next pursuit. A historian can read these shadows even without seeing his name on a page. For example, when insurance rates jump in one region and not another, a reader can safely ask, what changed? Often, the answer is a run of captures by a captain who knew how to ride the wind and the rumor. In the long hours between excitement, the crew lived like all working sailors. They mended lines in the morning, cleaned the deck by noon, and kept watch by night. When the moon was bright, a man could see a change in the water where a shoal lay close. When the night turned dark, he used soundings, lowering a line with a weight to read the depth. Meals were simple: hard bread softened with water, meat cut thin to stretch, peas and beans that filled a stomach even when flavor did not. Fresh finds, fish caught on a trailing line, a barrel of fruit from a prize felt like holidays. A harmonica, a fiddle, or even a drum made from a cask head turned an evening into a short escape from the smell of tar, salt, and men. When sickness came, it arrived quietly. A small cut reddened, a toothache grew angry, a cough stayed longer than it should. The surgeon tended with skill and limited tools. He boiled instruments when he could, used wine or rum to clean wounds, and sent men to sunlight when malady looked like the kind that yields to something fresh. The chronic problems of long voyages, scurvy, exhaustion, malnutrition, could not be disciplined away. Only fresh food and time ashore could push them back. A captured cargo of citrus was more than flavor. It was strength. One of the better preserved depositions, copied and recopied in local papers, described a scene that reveals Lowe's style without sensational detail. The witness wrote that the pirate captain spoke calmly to the master and then had his men move through the hold like clerks, taking what seemed necessary and burning what seemed troublesome. That phrasing, like clerks, stays with readers because it tells of a mood, order in the service of fear. It was not chaos that made him dangerous. It was order forced on others at speed. Many people imagine pirates as creatures of wildness. The truth here is stranger and more modern. Power came from process. There is a temptation, when describing a feared man, to grant him perfect foresight. This is a temptation worth resisting. He guessed wrong at times. He missed a shift in the wind and paid for it with 3 hours lost. He believed a lookout who said a sail was alone and found a companionship lurking behind a squall. He ordered a course toward a known refuge and learned that a patrol had learned the same map he used. These missteps mattered because they shook his crew's faith. A leader who depends on aura cannot afford many ordinary errors. Once the paint of inevitability chips, even a small crack can grow. 2 pursuers left marks on his timeline. and deserve simple, balanced telling. The first. A naval sloop commanded by a young officer with something to prove, chased low across a lattice of shoals. The wind fell light, and the chase threatened to settle into a drifting match. Then a land breeze rose at evening, and low, closer to shore, caught it first. He slid away along the dusky line of trees while the sloop, still out in open water, waited for the air to reach her. Some called it luck. Others called it the benefit of sailing small and close to the smell of land. The second pursuer, a privateer with a long, lean hull, nearly closed the gap the following month. Only a storm that flattened vision and forced both sides to shorten sail gave Low the opening to swing south. When morning came, sea and sky were clean, and no one could say where he had gone. A few voices from the record, quoted sparingly, frame his reputation with calm words. One prisoner said, "He kept his own counsel and did not shout unless haste required it." Another, describing the moments after surrender, reported, "The men moved through, each knowing his part. It lasted less than an hour." A third observed, "The master of our ship thought to parley. There was no time for that. These are not colorful lines. They are workmanlike. The lack of color gives them weight." Moving toward the end, it helps to look at the economic tale of his actions. Goods do not vanish, they move. Some reached gray market brokers in small ports, notorious for easy transactions. Some paid for the labor of specialists on board. Some bought a little peace in villages, where a quiet cove and a reliable spring made life easier for sailors far from home. Money also bought indifference in certain places. An official who looked past a suspicious cargo did so because looking past it paid today and did not seem to charge tomorrow. That assumption held until a Navy ship dropped anchor outside the same port and asked sharp questions. By then, a clever captain could be over the horizon. Rival captains understood that unity would help them. But the world of the sea often resists unity. A man who has eaten under another's command is careful about bows. A man who has commanded does not quickly bow again. Low's alliances therefore tended to be short, designed for convenience rather than trust. He shared information when it suited him. He kept a secret when it served him better. Rivals learned to expect a bargain that lasted no longer than the wind that brought them together. From a distance, this looks like independence. Up close, it looks like fragility, because solidarity gives a crew more choices when bad luck arrives. He did not invest in that kind of strength. The law, for its part, worked slowly and steadily. Sailors are natural carriers of news, and judges learned where to send questions. Once or twice, a captured pirate's confession pointed to a safe inlet that had not been watched before. The watch went there. The inlet suddenly felt less safe. On paper, these moves read as lines and letters. In life, they felt like a tightening circle. A career that rests on moving faster than institutions ends when institutions learn speed. It rarely ends with a shout. More often it ends with a knock on a door that used to have no door at all. As the circle tightened, frictions on board sharpened. An officer who never smiled began to laugh at odd times. A boatswain who used to quiet fights decided to watch one a minute too long. A good helmsman asked to be transferred to a prize crew and did not return. These are tiny hinges on which big doors swing. They suggest, without any need for dramatic flourishes, that confidence was slipping. Confidence is the invisible rope that binds people to a risky enterprise. When it frays, motions continue, but the music changes. His probable end sits at the crossroads of three stories. The first takes him to a foreign gallows after an unlucky anchorage. A patrol enters, arrests are swift, the court wastes no time, and the sentence comes as quickly as everything else in his life seemed to move. The second leaves him marooned by men who had had enough. A boat, a cask of water, a handful of biscuits, and the horizon that looks the same from every direction. The third hides him in plain sight under another name. He cuts wood, fixes boats and says little to strangers. Each version explains the silence that followed. Each has advocates, whose reading of the record emphasizes one cluster of pages over another. A careful closing admits that the record stops speaking clearly and that the strongest answer might be the one that begins with most likely, not certainly. Even so, the legacy feels certain enough to articulate without hesitation. In the years after his run, reps adjusted. Patrols adopted tactics, learned the hard way. Writers, some thoughtful and some hungry for sales, used his figure to anchor chapters about the limits of sea law. Painters and printmakers pictured a face that could be any face, really, because the details mattered less than the posture. A man who looks straight ahead while others look at him. Schoolchildren later learned a name or two from the age of piracy. His name, sometimes included, sometimes omitted, quietly influenced how the rest were imagined. That is cultural gravity. It does not shout, it leaps. At this late hour in the telling, a few fast clarifications protect the truth from fiction without spoiling anyone's enjoyment. He did not invent the black flag. He used what worked. He did not duel for show. He captured for gain. He did not spend months on elaborate traps. He stood near a road in the sea and let traffic come to him. He did not command a navy. He led a small organization that depended on speed, fear, and the element of surprise. These limits make his achievements more, not less, impressive in their own hard logic. By recognizing the ordinary means, one can appreciate the extraordinary results. The audience who enjoys a chill, steady walk through history may enjoy one last step, the map that lives behind every paragraph here. It shows currents an artist might draw with blue arrows. It shows winds an instructor might trace with chalk. It shows harbors where water runs clear over sand. And it shows muddy rivers that carry a coastline into the ocean grain by grain. On that map, a slight bend in an island chain becomes the place where he waited one spring. On that map, a church bell in a coastal town becomes the signal a watchman rang when a strange sail appeared. On that map, the distance between 2 points collapses into the time it takes a rumor to travel by mouth. The map is geography, and it is also memory. Before the close, 3 short scenes settle the mind with the last quiet notes. 1. A survivor, older now, tells a friend that the most frightening thing was not the weapons, but the speed with which order changed hands. He says, "One moment the master was in command. The next, it was as if we worked for them all along." 2. A clerk in a small court copies a confession and pauses to rub his eyes. He will copy 100 more before he retires, and this one, by a man who sailed with Lowe, will be a line he remembers when someone asks him what his long career amounted to. 3. A fisherman, turning in from the evening tide, watches a small boat row for shore and wonders if he has seen that silhouette before. He decides that he hasn't. He goes home to supper. The last paragraph belongs to the thesis stated plainly and without a raised voice. Edward Lowe's place in the history of piracy is not a puzzle built of heroic pieces. It is a case study in what happens when a leader treats terror as a tool and rumor as an ally. He learned the lanes, rode the winds, and convinced strangers to surrender the day to him. In doing so, he shortened fights and lengthened his season of success. But he also taught rivals how to move, taught governors how to respond, and taught his own men that rules could be broken from above. In time, those lessons came back to him. That is why his name still disturbs. It is not because he was a monster in a story. It is because he was a person who proved that fear can organize a crew until the very instant it organizes their revolt. For those who enjoy this kind of careful, late-night history, a small, friendly nudge points forward. Next time, the lens turns to a different cornerstone of the pirate world. A harbor that shaped legends, a code that governed rebels, or a treasure that drew maps across centuries. Another chapter told with the same calm voice, the same plain language, and the same promise to weigh what is known against what is believed, so everyone listening can follow the wake from the first word to the last.